titled New Approaches to Defining Vulnerability. Oh, so this is Dr. Peter Smith from the Institute for Work and Health. Just assume everyone knows who you are.
At least I do. Thank you, Al. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present. So, as Val said, my name is Peter Smith. I'm from the Institute for Work and Health. For those of you who don't know who the Institute for Work and Health is, we're a small research organisation about 400 metres down the road at the University of Dundas, predominantly funded through the Ministry of Labour, through sort of in a roundabout way from employee premiums. And so we're a small research organisation, probably about 60 to 70 full-time equivalents. So I'd like to start by focusing on, so when we talk about vulnerability, we can talk about vulnerability from many different perspectives, so employment vulnerability. What I'd like to focus on today is around definitions for occupational health and safety vulnerability. So in the area of occupational health and safety, we often talk about vulnerable workers. And I'd like to sort of cover some new approaches to how we might define this in a better way to identify what the levers might be to reduce vulnerability and how we might actually measure progress in the area. Just like to acknowledge the research team who have collaborated with me on this, and also the funders of the research. So when we think about vulnerable workers in an occupational health and safety context, often these are the sort of groups that we come up with. We talk about immigrants, we talk about young workers, we might talk about new workers, workers in particular types of industries. And one of the challenges is when we talk about workers in this way, first of all, when you describe a young worker as a vulnerable worker, people's minds straight away go to some personal characteristic of that worker. So if it's a young worker who's vulnerable, it's because they don't know how to say no. Can't approach risk. If you talk about an immigrant as a vulnerable worker, it's because the English is a problem. They have communication problems with the second language. So by describing groups as vulnerable in this way, we tend to focus in on the individual characteristics and ignore the work context in which these workers are involved in. Which leads to the belief that anyone who fits into these categories is a vulnerable worker. So anyone who's temporary is a vulnerable worker, but we know that's not the case. I was just sort of outlined that although a lot of them are, just because you're temporary doesn't necessarily mean you have to be vulnerable. And what it also does is distract the attention from people who don't fit into these categories, who also might be at risk of getting injured at work because they've got crummy workplaces. So just because you're not an immigrant, or just because you're maybe middle-aged and not an immigrant, that doesn't mean you can't get injured at work if the situation in your work environment is organised in a particular way. You are probably just as vulnerable as someone who is defined currently as a vulnerable worker. So when we describe workers in this way, we need to think about, well, what is it about these groups that make them vulnerable? As I said, is it individual characteristics? Is it the work environment that they're in? What are the relative contributions of each of those factors? This is a study which I did with Stephanie Premji quite a few years ago now, which looked at the risk of injury, so workplace injury, across different groups. So we had people who were not recent immigrants and not overqualified. So overqualification is a situation where you've got an educational level, but you're working in an occupation where the skills required for that occupation are below where your current level of education is. So we looked at 4 groups: non-recent immigrants who weren't overqualified, non-recent immigrants who were overqualified, which is the second group, recent immigrants who were not overqualified, and recent immigrants who were overqualified. And you can see here quite clearly that among recent immigrants, when recent immigrants are working in occupations which are commensurate with their educational levels, they're actually at no differential risk of injury compared to non-recent immigrants who are in similar types of occupations. It's only when recent immigrants are working in occupations for which they're overqualified, and we have a number of different potential mechanisms that explain this. We know that recent immigrants, when they come to Canada, tend to work in more physically demanding occupations. They tend to work in occupations that they're not trained for. The biggest information gap we have at the moment in Canada, which could have been addressed a couple of years ago when we did the survey of recent immigrants to Canada, is they actually didn't ask a single question about work injury. So you've got a massive survey, a massive cohort of recent immigrants, and you don't ask a single question about work injury. Potentially an oversight. So if we describe vulnerable workers in these ways, how do we know if vulnerability is increasing, if it's decreasing, or if it's staying the same? So often we set ourselves with an objective that we want to reduce vulnerability, either in workplaces or across the system. So how do we know if it's reducing? Well, we could look at these groups, and so this is an example of what might happen if we looked at men who were new and young, or women who were new and young, which are the solid lines here. We could look at the proportion of the workforce who's in high-risk industries. So this is men in high-risk industries, which are those in primary production, construction, manufacturing, and healthcare, and women who are in those industries. And maybe this could tell us what's happening to vulnerability in the labour market. So you can look at this slide and you'd say, well, no, I don't believe that can tell us anything. And it's true. All it does is tell us the proportion of workers who fit into these categories who are in our labour market. It doesn't tell us that vulnerability is increasing or decreasing, because this is actually not what we really would want to measure if we wanted to define vulnerability. So as a result, how do we know if our prevention activities are working? Well, the thing is, we don't. We don't know if what we're doing is reducing vulnerability. What we do is we take a measure which is a couple of steps away from vulnerability. So we've got vulnerability, which leads to increased risk of work injury, which leads to work injuries, which could lead to claim filing, which is the measure we use. So we've got a 4-step away process which tells us if we're making progress. And lost time claim rates can go up and down for a few reasons, one of which is work injuries are going up and down, but they can also go up and down through effective workplace accommodation and other claim management practices, and also just different systems which are available to workers to secure a wage replacement after they get injured. So we often talk about reducing vulnerability. We often set that as a goal, but we actually don't have a measure of vulnerability. So this is some work we started at the Institute. We came to this realisation shortly after the Dean panel had concluded in around 2011, that we talk about vulnerable workers, but we don't have a definition of what it is to be vulnerable, and as a result, we can't really measure any progress about reducing vulnerability. So we thought, well, we need to think a bit more about how to define vulnerability. We need to come up with a measure that we could use to do that. So we first of all started by developing a concept of vulnerability, and we thought, well, if you think about vulnerability, there's probably at least 4 things that lead to an increased risk of injury. One is the level of hazards that a worker is exposed to, but it's not hazards alone. What we had learned from the Dean panel was they had defined vulnerability as when a worker is exposed to hazards without the ability to control those hazards. So we thought, well, let's think about what are the factors that might help people protect themselves. Hazards, we just asked about normal hazards in the workplace. These are some of the questions we ask around policy and procedures, so things around if everybody receives the necessary workplace health and safety training when they start a job or when they change jobs. If health and safety is at least as important as production. Awareness, if they're clear about their rights and responsibilities. We also ask questions about if they're clear about their employers' rights and responsibilities. We also ask things about if they know how to do their job safely, which is a tricky question because most people think they can do their job safely up until the point that they get injured, and that's when they realise that they didn't know how to do their job safely. And then empowerment, so things around like, I know I could stop work if I think something was unsafe and I wouldn't be given a hard time. And so this 27-item questionnaire has 7 questions on hazards, 9 questions on hazards, 7 on policy and procedures, 6 on awareness and 5 on empowerment. And so what we did is we described vulnerability as this intersection between where people are exposed to hazards with inadequate protections to protect themselves from these hazards. So it's not just about hazards, but it's about the presence of factors that could protect workers. And using this framework, we could actually see a situation where we could imagine a labour market where nobody is in this most vulnerable group. So there are some hazards which will always be part of the way we work, so things like working at heights are always going to be in the workplace. But for those people who do work at heights, we could give them adequate protections in the area of policy and procedures, in the level of awareness, and in the level of empowerment, where those workers wouldn't be the most vulnerable workers, they would be what we would classify as somewhat vulnerable. So there's still a risk of injury, but it is reduced from those who are exposed to hazards with inadequate protections in place. So this gives us a metric to actually have a goal of 0 vulnerability, and it also shows that it's a dynamic process. So just because you're an immigrant doesn't mean you are always vulnerable. Just because you're young doesn't mean you're always vulnerable until you suddenly turn 26. And just because you're new to start your job doesn't mean you're suddenly on the 6-month mark, you're suddenly somehow invincible or invulnerable to work injury. We also term workers who are not exposed to hazards but have inadequate protections as somewhat vulnerable, because if hazards were to develop in that workplace, they would have no means to protect themselves, or there might be hazards that we haven't measured as part of our measure that might be relevant to them. So what have we learned by putting this measure into the field and sort of using it to better describe vulnerability? Well, one of the things we've learned is that different groups may experience vulnerability differently. So by having 3 different protections and an overall measure of vulnerability, we can describe policy and procedural vulnerability, whereas someone's exposed to hazards with inadequate policy and procedures. We can describe awareness vulnerability, when someone's exposed to hazards with inadequate awareness, and we can describe empowerment-related vulnerability, which is where someone's exposed to hazards with inadequate levels of empowerment. And this is presenting each of those 3 types of vulnerability across size of workplace. So less than 20 employees up to 500 plus employees. The blue bars are policy and procedural vulnerability. The red bars are awareness vulnerability, and the gold are empowerment. You can see here quite clearly that when it comes to differential vulnerability across workplace size, it's predominantly a policy and procedural issue. It's because workers in the small workplaces have much more policy and procedural vulnerability. They're much more likely to be exposed to hazards with inadequate policy and procedures than those in large organisations. There is a gradient around awareness vulnerability, but it's nowhere near as large as it is around the policy and procedures. And when it comes to empowerment, workers in the small workplaces are just as empowered as those in the larger organisations, and in fact it's the mid-sized organisations where people feel the least likely to speak up and participate actively in injury prevention activities through this power differential. We've also looked at this with recent immigrants. So in the surveys which we had originally done, we didn't recruit a lot of recent immigrants. This was just because these surveys were done through a polling company, and not a lot of recent immigrants answer the phone when someone rings them up and asks them to do a survey. So we worked with a number of settlement agencies in Ontario to recruit samples of recent immigrants so we could assess their levels of vulnerability and compare that to Canadian-born workers in our sample. And you can see here that when it comes to recent immigrants versus Canadian-born workers, most of the differences are around policy and procedural vulnerability, and in particular, empowerment-related vulnerability. Some of this is explained by differences in temporary employment relationships, the fact that they work in smaller workplaces in particular industries. But this difference in empowerment persists, and we've got some qualitative studies that have just concluded at the moment, and Bashak, a colleague of mine from the Institute, will be presenting tomorrow about some of those findings about talking with recent immigrants and better understanding what are the factors that drive this lower levels of empowerment among these workers. What are the actual drivers of that, so that they can be addressed. And so I'd like to sort of conclude in my last couple of slides and just talk about how, if we start focusing and defining vulnerability, how we might do a better job of understanding who are the workers that we actually want to protect in the province. So this is just a slide presenting differences between 2 groups that we currently use and we focus a lot of activity on, the new and young workers, and workers in high hazard industries. And so most of our provinces, we have programs which are dedicated towards these 2 groups. And so the red bars here are new and young workers, new or young workers. The blue bars are those who are not new and not young, so we fall outside the new and young focus. The gold bars are those who are in high hazard industries, and the sort of greyish bars are those who are not in high hazard industries. And you can see here, if we focus across our 3 particular types of vulnerability, our overall vulnerability, we can see that yes, new and young workers are more vulnerable, as determined by our measure, than those who are not new or young, and those in high hazard industries are more vulnerable than those who are not in high hazard industries. And that's why we focus on these groups, because they have higher injury rates, and obviously it would make sense that they would be more vulnerable. But you can also see that there is a reasonable proportion of workers who are not new and not young and still exposed to hazards without adequate protections. In the same way, there's people who don't fall into the high hazard industry groups who are still exposed to hazards with inadequate protections. And so if we thought about the rate of injuries, so this is the proportion of workers who were physically injured in the last 12 months. There are blue bars, the blue and the red bars are workers who are not new and not young, and the gold and the grey bars are in the first set of slides of those who are not new or young. And again, first two bars in the second series are workers in high-risk industries, and the second two bars are those that are in not high-risk industries. And so we can see here that there are two groups, the red and the gold group, which have by far and away the highest proportion of injury compared to the blue group and the grey group. And who are these workers? They're the ones who are exposed to hazards with inadequate protections. So just because you're not new and not young, if you're exposed to hazards with inadequate protections, you actually have the highest injury rate of any group in our sample. And you can see across high-risk industries and not high-risk industries, if you're exposed to hazards with inadequate protection, your injury rate's the same. What we really want to do is focus on making sure no worker is exposed to hazards with inadequate protections. So, to conclude, the key messages: we need to think about, we need to describe, and we need to measure vulnerability differently. We need to move away from names like immigrant, young, old, new, construction, manufacturing to describe vulnerability, and we need to actually focus on defining and describing the factors that lead to an increased risk of injury, which is exposure to hazards with inadequate protection. If we continue to focus on particular demographic or industry groups, we overlook other workers who are at increased risk of injury, because just because you don't fit into one of the categories you currently use doesn't mean you're not at increased risk of injury. And we end up drawing attention to the individual characteristics of the work, of the worker, rather than the broader environment that the worker is in. So I'm not saying that immigrant workers are not vulnerable workers. They are. They're vulnerable because they're more likely to work in occupations that have hazards with inadequate protections in place by their workplace, but also people who are not immigrants can also be in those occupations and they get injured as well. And then finally, groups we label vulnerability experience vulnerability differently, and I think it's important to recognise that because obviously the interventions to increase policy and procedures will be very different from those to increase empowerment, and really addressing the power differentials are the hardest nut to crack, but probably are going to lead to the greatest changes in reducing injury risk. For those of you who are interested in the measure, it's available on the Institute for Working Health website. You can download it for free. You can put it into workplaces. You can do whatever you want with it. If you want more information, we have a couple of peer-reviewed papers which describe all the information I presented today. We have on the IWH website, if you just search OHS vulnerability, you'll come to the web link, or you can email me and I'm happy to share any other information. Thank you.